Two soldiers were shot dead today at an IRA funeral in Belfast. They were dragged out of their car, beaten and then shot. The IRA have said they did it. It happened at the funeral of Kevin Brady, one of the three men killed at Milltown Cemetery on Wednesday. As the funeral cortege left St Agnes Church in Andersonstown Road, a car drove towards the mourners at high speed. As it stopped and tried to reverse, it was surrounded by an angry crowd. The two men were dragged to a park, beaten and shot. Their bodies were found on waste ground nearby. 3 people are helping police with their inquiries. The RUC has described the incident as an obscenity committed by depraved and perverted people. Mrs. Thatcher said the killings were an act of appalling savagery, adding, "There seem to be no depths to which these people will not sink." The Northern Ireland Secretary, Tom King, has called for a full and urgent report. He said people who were capable of such barbarous and animal savagery had no place in any civilized society. He promised that neither the government nor the security forces would rest until the perpetrators of this unspeakable act were brought to justice. The Labour leader, Neil Kinnock, said tonight, this must be the depth of tragedy.
With no police or army in sight, the funeral cortege left the church where Requiem Mass had been said on its way to Milltown Cemetery. There, IRA man Kevin Brady, who was killed on Wednesday, was due to be buried. A silver car drove quickly towards the procession. Taxis at the head of the cortege moved towards it, and within seconds it was surrounded by mourners who began to shout and try and get inside at the 2 occupants. There seemed to be early attempts to calm the situation. Then the mob were clearly frightened by something. One of the soldiers in the car had a gun. Eventually, the car's windows were put in and attempts were made to drag the 2 soldiers through them. One man started to beat the roof and windscreen with a starting handle, and then there was a shot. Scattered only briefly by the gunfire, the mourners got the 2 soldiers, who the army said were travelling between 2 military locations and had nothing to do with the funeral, out of the car. They were taken to a nearby park and beaten. The car the soldiers had been driving was taken from the scene and set on fire. It was burnt out before the brigade arrived. The bodies of the soldiers were found in an alley. The IRA later claimed that they'd executed an SAS unit who'd attacked the funeral cortege. The army, who denied that the men were either undercover or SAS, said the soldiers had no reason to be in the area of the funeral. They could only speculate about the reason for them being there.
And a few minutes ago, an army spokesman repeated that the 2 soldiers had not been authorized to be in the area where the funeral was taking place. The statement stressed they were not taking part in any undercover operation. The 2 men had been returning to Lisbon from a police station in West Belfast where they'd been doing routine maintenance work. The spokesman said the soldiers were in a civilian car with no communications equipment. Ireland Secretary Tom King is tonight in Belfast hearing first-hand reports on the murders of 2 soldiers by the IRA yesterday. Mr. King is also seeing a video film taken from a helicopter which shows how the 2 officers were beaten by a mob before being shot on nearby waste ground. Today, the army paid tribute to the men, Corporal Derek Wood and Corporal David Howes. A senior officer from their regiment, the Royal Corps of Signals, praised their courage. And tonight, Corporal Howes's father said he was very proud of the way his son had behaved and the self-control that he showed.
Corporal Derek Wood, who was driving the car, came from Carshalton in Surrey. He was 24 and unmarried and had been based in Northern Ireland for 4 years. His passenger, Corporal David Howes, came from Northampton. He was 23 and also single. He had only arrived in the province a week ago.
But I'm very glad that further carnage did not take place and that they showed restraint. And I think we should be very grateful that they did not use their weapons to perhaps more devastating effect than they could have done. And I think that shows bravery on their behalf, and I'm very, very proud of them for that.
A Catholic priest was one who tried to prevent the shooting of the 2 army corporals.
One of the local women came along with a coat and put it over the head of one of the soldiers and said he was somebody's son. Lord have mercy on him. And if you like, that summed up the situation for me, you know.
The soldiers were first attacked outside St Agnes's Church. Today, the congregation was told to acknowledge the shame and guilt they felt. No one could back off from the truth of the events. The priest asked what the Catholic community had in its midst.
We had foul and bloody murders committed in our parish yesterday. Our parish is seen as dripping in the blood of the murdered.
Sinn Féin maintains the people who killed the soldiers thought a second IRA funeral was being attacked. But the Catholic Church in West Belfast says hatred, fear and rage can never excuse the foul murders.
Today's funeral was the second within a week where the security forces have kept a low profile, but where there's been violence, as John Thorne reports.
The army explanation that the two soldiers were routinely changing locations raises questions about the tactics of the security forces in West Belfast. The army has rejected the Sinn Féin allegation that they were both SAS men, and it does seem highly unlikely that the SAS would have mounted a surveillance operation, leaving the soldiers so exposed to a mob without support readily available. But it is feasible that there was some sort of intelligence gathering operation around today's funeral. The police have insisted that their new discreet policing of Republican funerals has not created a no-go area in West Belfast. Tonight, after calling for the resignation of Mr. King and the Chief Constable of the RUC, the Reverend Ian Paisley demanded a new policy towards IRA funerals.
Those funerals that are going to be governed and patrolled and policed with Sinn Féin men with armbands, with walkie-talkies, and armed, as we have seen now that they have been armed, if they're going to be on the streets of Belfast, they have got to be swept off the streets, and the proper forces of the Crown take over their proper duties of policing all areas of this province.
Throughout the weekend, senior police officers will be urgently reappraising the whole policy of low-profile policing for IRA funerals. The tragic events of today suggest a return to the more robust presence is almost
Grenade
certain.
attack by lone loyalist gunman Michael Stone at Milltown Cemetery during the funeral of the 3 IRA members who died in Gibraltar. Kevin Brady, another member of the IRA, was killed during this attack. And it was at the funeral of IRA man Kevin Brady that the 2 soldiers drove into it as it made its way along Andersonstown Road. Their car was quickly surrounded and they were eventually overcome and dragged out. Both soldiers were armed, and in the ensuing scuffle, one of their guns was fired, but outnumbered, the soldiers were eventually taken into Casement Park, beaten and stripped, before being thrown over a wall to a waiting taxi, which then took them to waste ground at Penny Lane. There, as an army helicopter crew above looked on, and as live video pictures were relayed back to army headquarters, the 2 soldiers were shot to death, by men turning the soldiers' own weapons on them. The Crown contended that Murphy and Maguire were in the taxi which took the 2 soldiers on their brief final journey to their deaths, along with one of the gunmen. The judge described the defendants' explanations of how bloodstains from the 2 soldiers came to be on their clothing as a tissue of lies. The police spent thousands of pounds on video equipment for No. 1 courtroom at Crumlin Road for the 5 trials which are to be held arising out of the corporal's murders. They analysed 17 hours of videotape and studied 250,000 video stills in preparation for the trials. In all, 27 people were arrested on a variety of charges arising out of the murders. Today, the Lord Chief Justice praised the Detective Superintendent and his team of detectives, and he commended them to the new Chief Constable, Hugh Ansley. The police have stressed that their investigation is continuing. They're still trying to trace the 2 gunmen who actually pulled the triggers. It's thought the police know the identity of at least one of them. Last Friday, relatives of the 2 murdered soldiers travelled to Belfast to meet the team of detectives engaged in the murder hunt. Corporal Howe's parents and his sister were accompanied by Corporal Wood's father, and they also spent some time in the courtroom where today 2 men were jailed for life for the murders of Corporals Derek Wood and David Howes.
On the 10th of April 1998, the Good Friday Agreement ended 30 years of bitter sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland, known as the Troubles. For 3 decades, life had been marred by terrible violence. More than 3,600 people died, while tens of thousands suffered physical and psychological scars. At the heart of the conflict lay 2 clashing ideas about national identity. The mainly Protestant majority of Unionists and Loyalists wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom, while the mainly Catholic minority of Nationalists and Republicans wanted a united independent Ireland. Since the creation of Northern Ireland in 1922, Unionists had dominated its politics. Catholics were marginalised and experienced discrimination in housing, jobs and education. Protests ended in violent clashes with police and sectarian rioting broke out. In Belfast, hundreds of mostly Catholic homes and businesses were burned. As the civil unrest spiralled out of control, British troops were sent in to restore order. At first, many Catholics saw them as protectors, but tensions soon rose. When British paratroops shot dead 13 Catholic protesters in January 1972, with a 14th dying later, the event known as Bloody Sunday led to a sudden and dramatic escalation in violence. The British government responded by imposing direct rule over Northern Ireland's affairs from London. The Provisional IRA led an armed campaign to force a British withdrawal and create a united Ireland. Smaller Republican splinter groups like the INLA were also active. Loyalist paramilitary groups such as the UVF and UFF were set up in response. Both sides committed terrible atrocities and killed hundreds of people in the name of their cause, many of them innocent civilians. The first political attempt to end the violence came in 1973, when the Sunningdale Agreement created equal power sharing between Unionists and Nationalists. It crumbled in the face of the Loyalist-led Ulster Workers' Council strike. By the 80s, the IRA realised a military victory was unlikely. The election of Republican hunger striker Bobby Sands to the British Parliament in 1981 showed the IRA's political wing, called Sinn Féin, the value of political engagement. In 1985, the United Kingdom and Ireland reached a deal on the future status of Northern Ireland, but the Anglo-Irish Agreement met resistance from both Unionists and Republicans. Northern Ireland was in a political stalemate, and the bloodshed was unrelenting. But behind-the-scenes talks between politicians and paramilitaries continued. In the end, a combination of skillful diplomacy, leaps of faith, and sheer persistence laid the foundations for peace. The Good Friday Agreement contained many ideas that had been tried before, but for the first time it attempted to address the hopes and fears of all sides equally. It was approved in a referendum of the people of Northern Ireland in May 1998. The peace has not been perfect, and all sides have had bitter pills to swallow. There have been rows and constitutional battles, riots and protests, and armed dissidents still lurk in the shadows. Yet the peace endures, proving that dialogue, not violence, is the way to achieve a lasting end to conflict.